Grace Henderson's trembling fingers froze mid-motion as she stared at the hospital paperwork, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. The eviction notice, crumpled in her other hand, told one story, but the whispered voices from the doctor's lounge told another. 45 years of marriage, and now I'm worth more as a medical specimen than a human being. Dr. Chen's voice drifted through the crack in the door. The consortium approved $50,000 for exclusive rights to her case. Another voice responded with clinical detachment. Rural elderly, no family advocacy, perfect subject. Margaret Sullivan, Grace's neighbor who'd driven her here, dropped her purse with a sharp clatter. Her face went ashen as she processed what they'd overheard. "Grace, honey, what have we walked into?" Grace touched her wedding ring, the same ring Robert had placed there 45 years ago when doctors actually cared about healing. Now she sat abandoned in this sterile hallway at 2 a.m., reduced to dollar signs and research potential. Security footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing closer with each measured step. What price would they demand for her freedom? And how much time did she have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 weeks earlier, Grace Henderson had awakened to another empty morning in her 2-bedroom house on Maple Street in Salem, Massachusetts. The silence greeted her like an unwelcome visitor, broken only by the tick of Robert's grandfather clock in the hallway. She set the kitchen table for 2 out of habit, then caught herself and put away the extra plate with a sigh that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. At 67, Grace carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had taught 3rd grade for 32 years. But the arthritis in her hands and the slight stoop in her shoulders betrayed the weight of 3 years of widowhood. Her silver hair remained perfectly styled each morning, a ritual from her teaching days that she maintained just in case someone visits, though visitors had become increasingly rare since Robert's passing from COVID complications. The monthly Social Security check of $1,200 barely stretched to cover the mortgage, utilities, and groceries. Grace had mastered the art of choosing between heating oil and fresh vegetables, often opting for an extra sweater and canned soup. Her daughter Emma, a successful tech executive in San Francisco, called sporadically, usually leaving cheerful voicemails about promotions and new restaurants while Grace listened to the messages alone in her kitchen. "Lord willing, we'll talk soon, sweetie," Grace would whisper to the phone after each brief conversation, knowing Emma's busy life left little room for a lonely mother's concerns. The 42-year-old daughter she'd raised to be independent had perhaps learned the lesson too well. Grace filled her days with purpose where she could find it. Mornings began with coffee and the crossword puzzle, followed by tending her small garden where Robert's tomatoes still grew wild and untamed. Afternoons meant volunteering at the Methodist Church Food Bank, sorting donations for families she privately knew were hardly worse off than herself. The irony wasn't lost on her, but pride prevented her from taking anything home. Evenings were the hardest. She'd prepare simple meals while Judge Judy provided background noise, then eat while studying wedding photos spread across the dining table. 45 years of marriage stared back at her from faded Polaroids and formal portraits, Robert's laugh lines deepening with each passing decade until COVID stole his final smile. Her small house, once filled with the chaos of raising Emma and hosting neighborhood gatherings, now felt cavernous. The mortgage payment loomed each month like a thundercloud, and Grace had quietly considered a reverse mortgage, though the thought of losing Robert's legacy made her stomach turn. "Too old to start over, too young to give up," she'd mutter while sorting pills into weekly containers, a ritual that reminded her daily of her advancing age. Despite her struggles, Grace maintained her faith and dignity. She dressed properly each morning, applied lipstick even for trips to the mailbox, and never let the neighbors see her cry. The Methodist Church remained her sanctuary, though recent transportation issues had kept her home more Sundays than she cared to admit. This was Grace Henderson's world, small, quiet, and slowly shrinking. Until the morning, everything changed. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning while Grace prepared for her monthly ritual of washing her hair for church. Standing at the bathroom sink in her faded pink robe, she worked the shampoo through her silver strands with the same careful attention she'd given to lesson plans decades earlier. Her arthritic fingers moved methodically across her scalp until they paused, then pressed again with growing concern. There, just off-center on the crown of her head, was a small bump no larger than a pea. Grace's breath caught in her throat as her fingers explored the unfamiliar territory. The skin felt warm and slightly tender, raised enough to be unmistakable beneath her thinning hair. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, perhaps a mosquito bite or an age spot she'd simply never noticed, but deep in her chest, a familiar dread began to bloom. The memory struck her with crushing clarity. 3 years ago, Robert had discovered a similar bump behind his ear while shaving. "Probably nothing, Gracie," he'd said with that easy smile she'd loved for 4 decades. "Just getting old, I suppose." 6 months later, the oncologist was explaining treatment options for the aggressive melanoma that would ultimately claim her husband's life despite their prayers and determination. Grace's hands began to shake as she gripped the porcelain sink. The shampoo bottle slipped from her wet fingers and clattered to the floor, sending a sharp echo through the small bathroom. "Not now, Lord," she whispered to her reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. "I can't do this alone." Her brown eyes, still bright despite her years, stared back with a mixture of fear and stubborn resolve. She attempted to examine the bump with Robert's old hand mirror, angling it awkwardly while water dripped from her hair onto the bathroom tiles. The reflection showed only a distorted view of silver strands, offering no reassurance. Frustrated and increasingly anxious, she abandoned the effort and reached for her phone with trembling fingers. Emma's voicemail greeting played with its familiar professional tone. "You've reached Emma Henderson. Please leave a detailed message and I'll return your call as soon as possible." The beep seemed to mock Grace's hesitation before she managed a weak smile and spoke. "Hi, sweetie. Just checking in. Nothing important. Call when you get a chance. Love you." Nothing important. The lie tasted bitter as she ended the call and stared at her reflection once more. Everything about this felt important, terrifyingly so. But how could she burden Emma with another worry? Her daughter had worked so hard to build her career in California, and Grace had promised herself never to become the needy mother who pulled her child backward. Instead, Grace spent the afternoon hunched over her ancient computer, waiting for pages to load on the dial-up connection she couldn't afford to upgrade. WebMD offered a catalog of horrors: basal cell carcinoma, sebaceous cysts, lipomas, and worse possibilities that made her stomach churn. Each search result seemed designed to confirm her worst fears, and she finally closed the browser with shaking hands. That night, Grace lay awake listening to the house settle around her, one hand unconsciously reaching up to touch the bump. It seemed larger already, though she knew that was impossible. The darkness magnified every concern, every memory of Robert's decline, every financial worry that had kept her from seeking medical attention when problems first arose. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes and the bump had grown from a pea to the size of a marble. The week that followed brought a progression that defied Grace's attempts at denial. The bump continued growing, developing a small opening in its center that occasionally wept clear fluid. The pain intensified, especially at night, disrupting what little sleep her anxiety allowed. By the 14th day, Grace could no longer ignore what was happening to her body. The marble-sized bump had tripled in size, now resembling a small egg beneath her silver hair. The opening at its center had widened, occasionally releasing a mixture of clear fluid and blood that stained her pillowcases despite her careful positioning during sleep. The pain had evolved from intermittent discomfort to a constant throbbing that made concentration nearly impossible. Grace had stopped styling her hair altogether, afraid to disturb the growing mass. She'd missed 2 Sundays at church, claiming a mild cold to the concerned callers from the congregation. The truth was, she couldn't bear the thought of anyone noticing her condition, couldn't face the questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her world had shrunk to the confines of her small house, where she paced the hardwood floors and counted the days since Emma's last call. It was Margaret Sullivan, her 73-year-old neighbor, who finally forced the issue. Margaret had noticed Grace's absence from their daily chats across the back fence and the accumulation of newspapers on her front porch. When she knocked repeatedly without response, she used the spare key Grace had given her years earlier for emergencies. Margaret found Grace slumped over her kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and empty teacups, looking pale and disoriented. "Good Lord, Grace, you look terrible," Margaret said, her weathered hands immediately reaching to feel Grace's forehead. "How long have you been sitting here like this?" Grace tried to smile, to maintain the facade of strength she'd perfected over 3 years of widowhood, but the effort crumbled under Margaret's concerned gaze. "I'm fine, really. Just tired." But when she attempted to stand, dizziness forced her back into the chair, and Margaret caught sight of the blood-stained towel Grace had been holding against her head. "That's it," Margaret declared with the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "We're going to the emergency room right now, and I don't want to hear any arguments about money or insurance or whatever foolish pride is keeping you from getting help." The drive to Salem General Hospital passed in a blur of Grace's weak protests and Margaret's determined responses. "Don't you dare give me that nonsense about being a burden," Margaret said, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. "Robert would have my hide if I let you suffer like this, and you know it." Dr. James Walsh, the emergency room physician on duty, appeared harried and impatient as he examined Grace under the harsh fluorescent lights. His cursory inspection of the growing mass lasted less than 3 minutes before he stepped back with a dismissive shrug. "Probably a sebaceous cyst," he announced, already reaching for his prescription pad. "Common in elderly patients. This antibiotic should clear up any infection. Follow up with your primary care doctor in 2 weeks." Grace's heart sank as the nurse handed her the discharge papers along with a bill that made her vision blur. $800 for 15 minutes of cursory attention. She fumbled for her Medicare card with shaking hands, knowing the copay alone would drain what remained in her checking account. Margaret's sharp intake of breath told Grace her neighbor had seen the amount as well. "Doctor," Margaret said, her voice carrying the steel that had intimidated generations of misbehaving children, "doesn't this warrant further investigation? It's been growing rapidly, and she's in considerable pain." "Doctor." Walsh barely glanced up from the tablet he was updating. "Cysts can be uncomfortable. The antibiotic will help. If it doesn't improve in 2 weeks, her primary doctor can refer her to dermatology." He was already moving toward the next curtained area, his attention clearly elsewhere. The antibiotic proved as ineffective as Grace had feared. Over the following week, the mass continued its relentless growth, now approaching the size of a golf ball and becoming increasingly painful. The discharge changed from clear to bloody, and Grace developed a low-grade fever that left her weak and disoriented. She found herself unable to complete simple tasks, sleeping fitfully in her recliner because lying flat intensified the throbbing pain. It was during this week of deterioration that Emma made her surprise visit. Grace heard the key in the front door on a Thursday evening and managed to call out weakly from her chair. When Emma appeared in the living room doorway, her face went white with shock. "Mom, oh my God, what's wrong with you?" Emma rushed to her mother's side, taking in Grace's pale complexion, the makeshift bandage on her head, and the general air of someone who'd been suffering alone for far too long. "Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me you were sick?" Grace tried to summon her usual reassuring smile, the one that had convinced Emma for years that everything was fine. I didn't want to worry you, sweetheart. You're so busy, and I thought it was just— Just what? A minor problem that's turned you into this? Emma's voice cracked with a mixture of anger and fear as she gently examined the towel Grace had been holding against her head. Emma's presence transformed Grace's small house from a place of quiet suffering into a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The successful tech executive who commanded boardrooms in San Francisco became a fierce advocate for her mother, wielding her phone like a weapon against the bureaucratic maze of healthcare systems. Grace watched with a mixture of pride and embarrassment as her daughter dismantled the careful facade of independence she'd maintained for 3 years. "Mom, you've been rationing your blood pressure medication?" Emma's voice carried the sharp edge of someone discovering a truth they weren't prepared to face. She stood in the kitchen holding 3 pill bottles that should have been refilled weeks earlier. "And when was the last time you had a proper meal? There's nothing in this refrigerator but expired yogurt and wilted lettuce." Grace pulled her worn robe tighter around her shoulders, feeling exposed under her daughter's scrutiny. "I manage just fine, Emma." "I don't need— You don't need help? Look at yourself, Mom. Look at this place." Emma gestured toward the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the layer of dust on surfaces that had once sparkled, the general air of someone treading water alone. "This isn't managing. This is drowning." The words hung between them like an accusation and a revelation. Grace had spent years protecting Emma from the reality of her struggles, maintaining the fiction that Robert's death hadn't shattered not just her heart, but her financial security. Now, under the unforgiving fluorescent light of the kitchen, the pretense crumbled. Emma's expression softened as she saw tears threatening in her mother's eyes. She set down the pill bottles and wrapped Grace in the kind of embrace that had once made childhood nightmares disappear. "We're going to fix this, Mom. All of it. But first, we're getting you proper medical care, even if I have to carry you to the hospital myself." The battle with insurance proved as frustrating as Grace had feared. Emma spent hours on hold, her professional voice growing increasingly strained as she navigated automated systems and uninterested representatives. "Yes, I understand that dermatology requires a referral," she said into her phone for the 5th time that morning, pacing Grace's living room like a caged animal. "What I don't understand is why my mother has to suffer for 2 more weeks waiting for an appointment when she clearly needs immediate attention." Grace watched her daughter fight battles she'd been too exhausted and overwhelmed to wage herself. The guilt was almost as painful as the throbbing in her head. "Emma, sweetheart, maybe we should just—" "No!" Emma's voice cut through the suggestion with finality. "We're not giving up, and we're not settling for substandard care because you're on Medicare and live in a small town. You taught me to stand up for what's right, remember?" The dermatology appointment finally materialized 3 days later, secured through Emma's persistence and willingness to pay out of pocket for an expedited consultation. Dr. Sarah Chen's office occupied a modern medical building that made Salem General's emergency room look shabby by comparison. Grace felt intimidated by the sleek surfaces and expensive artwork, acutely aware of her discount store clothing and the bandage covering her increasingly problematic scalp. Dr. Chen herself appeared younger than Emma, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to solving medical mysteries. Her initial examination seemed routine, professional questions delivered with practiced efficiency while she made notes on her tablet. "How long did you say this has been present, Mrs. Henderson?" "About 6 weeks now," Grace replied, unconsciously touching the bandage. "It started small, just a little bump, but it's been growing steadily." "And you haven't traveled recently? No exposure to unusual environments or materials?" Dr. Chen's questions felt oddly specific, but Grace shook her head to each inquiry. When Dr. Chen lifted the bandage, her composed expression faltered for just a moment. The mass had continued growing despite the antibiotic, now roughly the size of a chicken egg with an opening that wept bloody fluid onto the examining table. "I'd like to take a closer look with the dermatoscope," she said, her voice carefully neutral. The dermatoscope revealed details invisible to the naked eye, and Grace watched Dr. Chen's face change as she peered through the specialized lens. The confident demeanor gave way to something that looked distinctly like surprise, then concern, then genuine puzzlement. After several minutes of examination, Dr. Chen stepped back and removed her gloves with movements that seemed suddenly careful, deliberate. "Mrs. Henderson, I'd like to consult with a colleague, if you don't mind waiting a few minutes." The request sounded casual, but Grace caught the undercurrent of urgency in the doctor's voice. Emma squeezed her mother's hand as Dr. Chen left the room, her phone already pressed to her ear. The colleague, who appeared 15 minutes later, was Dr. Michael Torres, an older physician with the gravitas of someone who'd seen everything the field of dermatology could offer. His examination was more thorough, involving additional instruments and whispered consultations with Dr. Chen. Grace felt increasingly like a specimen rather than a patient as they discussed her case in medical terminology she couldn't follow. "We'd like to perform a biopsy," Dr. Torres finally announced, turning his attention back to Grace and Emma. "This presents some unusual characteristics that warrant further investigation." "Unusual how?" Emma's question carried the sharp focus of someone accustomed to demanding clear answers in business meetings. Dr. Chen and Dr. Torres exchanged glances before Dr. Chen responded. "The appearance and growth pattern aren't entirely typical of what we normally see in this region. A biopsy will help us determine the exact nature of the tissue and plan appropriate treatment." The biopsy itself was a minor procedure performed under local anesthesia, but the waiting period that followed stretched Grace's nerves to their breaking point. Emma had taken family leave from her job, a sacrifice that simultaneously touched and troubled Grace. Her daughter's presence was a blessing, but the financial implications weighed heavily on Grace's mind. Emma's career had always been her primary focus, and Grace couldn't bear the thought of becoming an obstacle to her daughter's success. "You should go back to California," Grace said one evening as they sat in her living room, Emma working on her laptop while Grace pretended to watch television. "Your job is too important to risk for this." Emma looked up from her screen, her expression a mixture of exasperation and tenderness. "Mom, you're more important than any job. Besides, I can work remotely for now. The company understands." But Grace could see the stress in her daughter's posture, the way Emma's phone buzzed constantly with work demands she couldn't fully ignore. The sacrifice felt too large, too reminiscent of the way Robert had given up opportunities to care for others throughout his life. When Dr. Chen called 5 days later, her voice carried an odd note that Grace couldn't quite interpret. "Mrs. Henderson, I'd like you to come in as soon as possible. We have the biopsy results, and there are some additional tests we'd like to discuss." The appointment was scheduled for the following morning, but Dr. Chen's tone suggested an urgency that made sleep impossible. Grace lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Emma pace the hallway and make quiet phone calls to colleagues who were covering her responsibilities 3,000 miles away. What they discovered the next morning would change everything Grace thought she knew about her condition, her community, and the nature of the medical care she'd trusted with her life. As they sat in Dr. Chen's office waiting for results that would reshape their understanding of the past 6 weeks, neither Grace nor Emma could have imagined the journey that lay ahead, or the profound ways their relationship would be tested and ultimately strengthened by what was coming. The biopsy results sat in a manila folder on Dr. Chen's desk, containing answers that would transform Grace from a typical elderly patient into something far more interesting to the medical community and far more vulnerable to those who saw opportunity in her condition. Dr. Chen's office felt smaller when Grace and Emma returned the next morning, as if the walls had closed in overnight. The dermatologist sat behind her mahogany desk with the manila folder containing Grace's biopsy results, but her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked distinctly like excitement barely contained beneath professional composure. "Mrs. Henderson, your case has generated considerable interest among my colleagues," Dr. Chen began, opening the folder with deliberate ceremony. "The biopsy revealed something quite extraordinary. What you have isn't a typical cyst or tumor, but rather a parasitic infestation, specifically a botfly larva that has been growing beneath your scalp." Emma's sharp intake of breath filled the silence that followed. Grace felt the words wash over her without fully comprehending their meaning. "A what?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "A botfly larva. Dermatobia hominis, to be precise. It's a parasitic insect typically found only in Central and South America, particularly in tropical regions of Guatemala, Honduras, and southern Mexico. What makes your case remarkable is that we've never documented this species in New England. In fact, there are fewer than 50 recorded cases in the entire continental United States." Dr. Chen's enthusiasm was becoming more apparent with each word, her professional mask slipping to reveal something that made Grace increasingly uncomfortable. "We've already contacted the Centers for Disease Control, and they're extremely interested in studying your case. There's also significant interest from the parasitology department at Harvard Medical School." Emma leaned forward in her chair, her protective instincts sharpening. "Doctor, you're talking about my mother like she's a research specimen. What does this mean for her treatment? How do we get this thing out of her?" "Oh, the treatment is relatively straightforward, Doctor," Chen replied almost dismissively. "A simple surgical extraction under local anesthesia, 30 minutes, maybe less. But before we proceed, there are some opportunities we should discuss." Grace watched Dr. Chen reach for another folder, this one considerably thicker than the first. "Your case has already attracted attention from medical researchers and pharmaceutical companies. There's substantial funding available for documenting rare parasitic cases like yours. We're talking about a potential windfall of $50,000, possibly more, just for allowing us to study and document your treatment process." The sum hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Grace thought of her unpaid bills, the mortgage that loomed over her like a sword, the medications she'd been rationing. $50,000 would solve every financial problem that had kept her awake nights for the past 3 years. "What exactly would that involve?" Emma asked, her tone cautious but not dismissive. Dr. Chen's smile widened. "Comprehensive documentation of the extraction procedure, detailed interviews about how you might have contracted the parasite, perhaps some follow-up studies. Nothing invasive, really. Just allowing medical science to learn from your unique situation." Grace felt a flutter of hope mixed with unease. The money would change everything, but something in Dr. Chen's manner reminded her of the pharmaceutical salespeople who used to visit Robert's medical practice, polished, persuasive, and ultimately more interested in profit than patients. "I need to think about this," Grace said quietly. "It's a lot to process." Dr. Chen's expression shifted subtly, the warmth cooling by a few degrees. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson, but I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor. The longer we wait, the more the larva develops, and the more complex the extraction becomes. Also, there are other medical institutions that would be interested in taking over your case if you're not comfortable with our proposal." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Emma caught it immediately, her jaw tightening in a way Grace recognized from her daughter's childhood when someone had tried to intimidate her on the playground. "Are you suggesting that my mother's medical care is contingent on her agreement to be part of your research project?" Emma's voice carried the steel of someone accustomed to corporate negotiations. "Not at all. Dr. Chen backtracked smoothly. I'm simply explaining the opportunities available. Your mother's care is our primary concern naturally. But Grace could see through the diplomatic language to the calculation beneath. She was no longer just a patient with a medical problem. She had become a commodity with a value that extended far beyond her personal well-being. That evening, Emma paced Grace's living room while making phone calls to colleagues who might know medical lawyers. Grace sat in Robert's old recliner, overwhelmed by the day's revelations and the decisions that lay before her. The parasitic larva in her scalp had become secondary to the parasitic interest of the medical establishment that saw dollar signs in her suffering. "Mom, something doesn't feel right about this," Emma said after ending her latest call. "The way Dr. Chen talked about you, about the research opportunities, it felt more like a business proposition than a medical consultation." Grace nodded slowly, her hand unconsciously reaching toward the bandage on her head. The creature beneath her skin had grown larger still, its presence a constant reminder of her vulnerability. "Your father used to say that medicine had become more about money than healing," she said softly. "I never thought I'd experience it firsthand." Emma sat on the couch across from her mother, leaning forward earnestly. "We don't have to decide tonight. Let me do some research, make some calls. Maybe there are other doctors who can perform the extraction without turning you into a case study." But Grace was thinking about the $50,000, about the mortgage payments and medical bills that had turned her golden years into a financial nightmare. She was thinking about Emma's sacrificed career opportunities and the burden her mother's problems had become. "What if this is a gift?" Grace said quietly. "What if God is providing for us in an unexpected way?" Emma's expression softened with understanding and concern. "Mom, if you want to do this, I'll support you. But let's make sure we understand exactly what we're agreeing to. Let's read the fine print before you sign anything." The contract arrived by courier the next morning, a thick document filled with legal terminology that neither Grace nor Emma fully understood. As they struggled through pages of clauses and stipulations, one thing became increasingly clear. The research consortium wanted more than just documentation of Grace's case. They wanted comprehensive rights to her story, her image, and her ongoing medical care related to the parasitic infection. Grace would essentially become property of the medical research establishment, her future healthcare decisions subject to their approval and oversight. The $50,000 came with strings that could bind her for the rest of her life. As Grace sat at her kitchen table with the contract spread before her, she realized that the parasitic larva beneath her scalp might not be the most dangerous predator she was facing. The contract's true nature became clear when Emma's friend Rachel, a corporate lawyer in Boston, reviewed the documents over a tense weekend phone call. Her voice carried the gravity of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis as she explained the implications to Grace and Emma sitting around the kitchen table. "This isn't a standard research agreement," Rachel said through the speakerphone. "This is essentially a lifetime servitude contract disguised as medical collaboration. Once Grace signs this, every future medical decision related to parasitic infections, even tangentially, becomes subject to consortium approval. They own her story, her image, her medical records, and her body's response to treatment in perpetuity." Grace felt the blood drain from her face as the reality sank in. The $50,000 that had seemed like salvation was actually the price of her freedom. Emma's hands clenched into fists on the table, her knuckles white with suppressed rage. "What if she doesn't sign?" Emma asked. "Then they'll likely withdraw their treatment offer and transfer her case to a public hospital where she'll receive basic care without any financial compensation," Rachel replied grimly. "They've structured this so that Grace has no real choice, accept exploitation or face potential medical abandonment." The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and impossible decisions. Grace's condition worsened significantly. The larva had grown to the size of a small plum, and the pain had become constant and severe. She developed a fever that left her weak and disoriented, often losing track of conversations mid-sentence. Emma watched her mother deteriorate while fielding increasingly aggressive calls from Dr. Chen's office about scheduling the documentation procedure. Monday morning brought a new crisis that shattered any remaining illusions about Dr. Chen's intentions. Grace discovered that her private conversations with Emma had been recorded through hidden devices in the examination room. Worse, Dr. Chen had already been using Grace's story in medical conferences without her consent, presenting her case as an example of successful patient partnership in advancing medical science. "She's been showing pictures of my head at medical conferences?" Grace asked, her voice hollow with disbelief as Emma read from the conference program she'd found online. "Pictures of me with my name attached?" Emma's laptop screen displayed Dr. Chen's presentation from the New England Medical Society's annual meeting, complete with close-up photographs of Grace's scalp and detailed medical information. The presentation was titled "Tropical Parasitology in Temperate Climates, a Case Study in Patient-Researcher Collaboration," as if Grace had already agreed to be their research subject. The violation felt more invasive than the parasite itself. Grace had spent her entire life as a private person, someone who valued dignity above all else. To discover that her medical condition had become entertainment for doctors' conferences, while she was still deciding whether to sign their contract, was devastating beyond measure. The emotional blow manifested physically. Grace's fever spiked that evening, and she began experiencing episodes of confusion and memory loss. Emma found her mother trying to set the table for Robert, talking to him as if he were sitting in his usual chair. The infection was spreading, and Grace's body was beginning to shut down under the strain. Emma called Dr. Chen's emergency line, desperate for immediate medical intervention. The response was coldly professional. "Mrs. Henderson needs to sign the research agreement before we can proceed with treatment." Hospital policy requires all documentation to be completed before any surgical procedures. "My mother is delirious with fever," Emma shouted into the phone. "She needs medical care now, not bureaucratic paperwork." "I understand your concern, but our hands are tied without proper authorization. Perhaps you'd like to reconsider the consortium's generous offer." The threat was explicit now. Sign the contract or watch Grace suffer. Emma hung up the phone and immediately called 911. But Salem General's emergency room doctor took one look at Grace's condition and declared it too complex for their facilities. "She needs a specialist," he said. "This is beyond our capabilities." Every door seemed to lead back to Dr. Chen and her research consortium. Grace, in her moments of clarity, understood the trap they'd constructed around her. She was too sick to travel to another city for treatment, too poor to afford private care, and too vulnerable to fight a medical establishment that saw her as an opportunity rather than a person. "Maybe I should just sign it," Grace whispered to Emma during one lucid moment late Tuesday night. "What choice do I have? I'm going to die anyway if we keep waiting." Emma sat beside her mother's bed, holding the hand that had once guided her through homework and heartbreak. "There has to be another way, Mom. There has to be someone who will help us without selling your soul." But as Grace's fever climbed and her confusion deepened, even Emma began to wonder if they were fighting a battle they couldn't win. The parasite in Grace's head was killing her slowly, but the medical system surrounding them threatened to consume her dignity and autonomy completely. Grace Henderson, who had spent 67 years building a life of quiet respectability, now faced a choice between death and surrender to forces that valued her suffering more than her humanity. The unexpected savior arrived in the form of Maria Santos, a 24-year-old lab technician who had been working the night shift at Salem General when Grace's tissue samples first arrived for analysis. Maria had been the one to identify the parasitic larva under high magnification, spending hours researching the unusual specimen that had appeared in their small New England hospital. What she discovered in her investigation would change everything. Maria had grown up in Salem's Hispanic community, the daughter of immigrants who cleaned offices and worked double shifts to send their children to college. She was pursuing her bachelor's degree in medical technology while working nights to pay for school, dreaming of eventually becoming a physician's assistant. Her connection to Grace's case had begun as professional curiosity, but her deeper investigation revealed a pattern of exploitation that made her blood boil. Working through hospital databases and medical conference records, Maria uncovered evidence of Dr. Chen's systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly patients with rare conditions. Grace was not the first. Over the past 3 years, Dr. Chen's research consortium had identified 12 similar cases across New England, each involving isolated elderly patients with unusual medical presentations. The pattern was always the same: initial offers of financial compensation followed by contracts that essentially made patients property of the research group. More disturbing were the financial records Maria discovered through her access to billing systems. The consortium received substantial funding from pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers for each research subject they acquired. Grace's case alone was worth nearly $200,000 in research grants, making the $50,000 offer seem like pocket change in comparison. What made Maria's discovery personal was a connection she hadn't initially recognized. While reviewing Grace's address and background information, she realized that Grace Henderson had been her family's neighbor during Maria's childhood. More significantly, Grace had been the volunteer English tutor who had helped Maria's mother navigate parent-teacher conferences and school paperwork when Maria was in elementary school. Maria remembered the kind lady who would arrive at their small apartment every Tuesday evening with homemade cookies and patient explanations of homework assignments that Maria's mother couldn't understand in her limited English. Grace had never accepted payment for her tutoring, always insisting that helping neighbors was simply what people did for each other. She had attended Maria's high school graduation, beaming with pride as if Maria were her own granddaughter. The realization that this same woman was now being exploited by the medical system that Maria worked within felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about healing and helping others. Maria spent her lunch breaks researching medical ethics laws and patient rights, building a case that could expose the consortium's practices. Her breakthrough came when she discovered that Dr. Chen had been recording patients without proper consent, a clear violation of Massachusetts medical privacy laws. The hidden recording devices in examination rooms were not disclosed to patients, and the footage was being used for educational presentations without patient authorization. This was not just unethical, it was criminal. Maria faced a crucial decision that could derail her career before it truly began. Speaking out against Dr. Chen meant risking her job, her references, and possibly her future in healthcare. The consortium had influence throughout the regional medical community, and challenging them could blacklist her from other positions. But the image of Grace, sitting confused and frightened in that examination room, being manipulated by people who saw her as a profit opportunity rather than a human being, made the choice clear. On Wednesday evening, Maria appeared at Grace's front door, carrying a manila envelope filled with documentation and a determination that reminded Emma of her mother's younger self. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Maria Santos. You used to help my mother with my homework when I was little." Grace's fever had broken that morning, leaving her weak but lucid for the first time in days. She studied Maria's face, her memory slowly connecting the confident young woman before her with the shy 8-year-old who used to hide behind her mother during tutoring sessions. Little Maria? Carmen's daughter? "My goodness, look how you've grown." "I work at the hospital lab," Maria explained, settling into a kitchen chair across from Grace and Emma. "I was the technician who identified what's in your scalp. But more importantly, I've discovered what Dr. Chen and her colleagues are really doing to you." Maria spread the documents across Grace's kitchen table, explaining the financial arrangements, the pattern of exploitation, and the legal violations she had uncovered. Emma listened with growing amazement and rage, while Grace felt a mixture of vindication and betrayal wash over her. "They're making hundreds of thousands of dollars off my suffering?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nearly $250,000 for your case specifically," Maria confirmed. "And you're not the first. They've done this to at least 11 other elderly patients across New England over the past 3 years. Emma leaned back in her chair, processing the magnitude of the deception. "So what can we do about it? How do we stop them?" Maria's smile carried the determined optimism of someone who had inherited her parents' fighting spirit. "We expose them. I've already contacted an investigative reporter at the Boston Globe who specializes in medical fraud cases. She's very interested in this story. I've also reached out to the State Medical Board and the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division." "But what about my mother's immediate medical needs?" Emma asked. "She still has this thing growing in her head and she's getting sicker." Maria had anticipated this question. "I've been in contact with Dr. Rebecca Foster, a dermatologist in Boston who specializes in parasitic infections. She's agreed to perform the extraction surgery at cost, no research requirements, no exploitation. She actually trained in Central America and has performed dozens of these procedures. She can see your mother tomorrow if you're willing to make the trip." Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the weight of weeks of fear and helplessness began to lift. This young woman, whose homework she had helped with colored pencils and patience 20 years ago, had returned to save her from a nightmare she couldn't escape alone. "Why?" Grace asked. "Why are you risking your career to help me?" Maria reached across the table and gently took Grace's weathered hand in her young, strong one. "Because you taught me that we help our neighbors, Mrs. Henderson. You showed my family what kindness looks like when we were scared and alone in a new country. Now it's my turn to help you when you're scared and alone in a system that's forgotten how to be kind." The irony was profound and beautiful. Grace's years of quiet service to her community had planted seeds that would grow into her salvation. The little girl she had tutored in multiplication tables had learned far more than mathematics in those evening sessions around a kitchen table, much like this one. Emma squeezed her mother's other hand, completing a circle of 3 generations of women who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with lawyers or money, but with the simple decision to do what's right for someone who needs help. Dr. Rebecca Foster's office in Boston's medical district felt like a sanctuary compared to the sterile, predatory atmosphere Grace had experienced with Dr. Chen. The waiting room displayed certificates from tropical medicine programs and photographs of medical missions in Guatemala and Honduras, suggesting a physician who had chosen healing over profit. When Dr. Foster emerged to greet them, her warm smile and genuine concern immediately put Grace at ease. "Mrs. Henderson, I've reviewed your case materials, and I want you to know that what's happened to you is completely unacceptable," Dr. Foster said as they settled in her consultation room. "No patient should ever be exploited for their medical condition, especially someone dealing with something as unusual and frightening as this." The examination was thorough but gentle, Dr. Foster explaining each step as she worked. "You have what appears to be a fully mature botfly larva, probably about ready to emerge naturally. The extraction will be straightforward. I've performed this procedure many times during my work in Central America." Emma watched her mother's face relax for the first time in weeks as Dr. Foster outlined the treatment plan. No hidden recording devices, no research contracts, no exploitation disguised as medical care, just a doctor who wanted to help her patient heal. The surgery took place the following morning in Dr. Foster's minor procedure suite. Grace insisted on staying awake during the extraction, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "After everything this little creature has put me through, I want to meet him face to face," she told Dr. Foster with a wry smile that reminded Emma of the resilient woman who had raised her. Maria had driven down from Salem to be present during the procedure, taking a personal day from work despite the risk it posed to her already precarious position at the hospital. She held Grace's hand as Dr. Foster carefully numbed the area and began the delicate process of removing the larva without damaging the surrounding tissue. "There he is," Dr. Foster announced, after 15 minutes of careful work, holding up the fully formed larva with surgical forceps. The creature was larger than any of them had expected, nearly 2 inches long and unmistakably alive. Grace stared at the parasite that had terrorized her for nearly 2 months, feeling a mixture of revulsion and odd relief. "Fernando," Grace said softly, using the name she had given the creature weeks earlier. "After all we've been through together, I suppose you deserve a proper introduction." The humor in her mother's voice brought tears to Emma's eyes. This was the Grace Henderson who had faced down difficult students, budget cuts, and the loss of her husband with dignity and unexpected grace. The woman who could find something to laugh about even while a parasite was being extracted from her head. Dr. Foster cleaned and sutured the small wound, applied a proper dressing, and prescribed antibiotics to prevent secondary infection. The entire procedure cost less than Grace's original emergency room visit, and Dr. Foster accepted Medicare assignment without question. "Medicine should be about healing people, not exploiting them," she said simply when Emma tried to thank her for the reasonable charges. Meanwhile, Maria's investigation had triggered a cascade of consequences that would reshape the regional medical landscape. The Boston Globe reporter, Janet Morrison, had spent weeks verifying Maria's documentation and interviewing other victims of Dr. Chen's research consortium. The story broke on a Tuesday morning with the headline, "Medical Exploitation: How Researchers Prey on Vulnerable Patients." The article detailed not just Grace's case, but a pattern of systematic abuse targeting elderly, isolated, and financially vulnerable patients across New England. The investigation revealed that Dr. Chen's consortium had generated over $2 million in research funding by exploiting patients who had little recourse against medical authority figures. Within hours of publication, Dr. Chen was suspended from her position pending investigation by the medical board. The research consortium's funding was frozen, and several other physicians were implicated in the exploitation scheme. Grace found herself thrust into the role of reluctant whistleblower, her story becoming a catalyst for broader reforms in medical research ethics. The FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division launched a formal investigation interviewing Grace and the other victims Maria had identified. Emma was amazed by her mother's composure during these interviews, the way Grace could articulate her experience without bitterness, focusing instead on preventing other vulnerable patients from facing similar exploitation. "I'm not angry," Grace told Agent Patricia Williams during her formal statement. "Well, maybe I am a little angry, but mostly I'm grateful that we found out the truth before I signed away my rights. And I'm grateful for the people who helped us fight back." The community response was overwhelming. Grace's former students, now adults with families of their own, organized fundraisers to help with her medical expenses. The Methodist Church established a patient advocacy fund in her honor. Neighbors who had known Grace for decades but hadn't fully understood her struggles rallied around her with practical support and emotional encouragement. Most surprisingly, Emma announced her decision to relocate permanently to Massachusetts. "I've been climbing corporate ladders for 20 years trying to prove something to myself," she told her mother over dinner in their childhood kitchen. "But watching you face all this alone made me realize what I've been missing. My company is letting me establish a satellite office here in Salem. I can have my career and my family, too." Grace protested, worried that Emma was sacrificing her hard-won success for an aging mother's needs. But Emma's decision came from a deeper realization about what constituted a successful life. The crisis had revealed not just Grace's vulnerability, but Emma's own isolation in her California career, the way professional achievement had become a substitute for meaningful relationships. Maria's courage in exposing the medical fraud came with professional consequences, as she had feared. Dr. Chen's allies in the hospital administration found reasons to question her performance and ultimately terminated her employment. However, Dr. Foster offered Maria a position in her practice, recognizing the young woman's integrity and dedication. Maria also received a full scholarship to Boston University's Physician Assistant Program, funded by an anonymous donor who turned out to be one of Grace's former colleagues. The legal resolution took months, but eventually resulted in financial settlements for all the exploited patients. Grace's portion was substantial enough to secure her house permanently and establish a small emergency fund for future medical needs. More importantly, the case led to state legislation requiring enhanced informed consent procedures for medical research and stronger protections for vulnerable patient populations. 6 months after her ordeal began, Grace sat in her garden watching Emma and Maria plant vegetables for the coming season. The surgical site on her scalp had healed completely, hidden beneath her silver hair that had grown back fuller than before. The physical trauma was gone, but the emotional growth remained. "You know what I learned from all this?" Grace asked as she watched the two younger women work the soil. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best discoveries about who we really are and who truly cares about us." Emma looked up from the tomato plant she was setting, dirt streaking her expensive business clothes that she now wore for gardening instead of boardroom meetings. "And sometimes, the people we helped years ago become the ones who save us when we need it most." Maria straightened from planting herbs, her acceptance letter to physician assistant school tucked proudly in her back pocket. "My mother always said that kindness is like seeds. You plant them everywhere and never know which ones will grow into something beautiful." Grace smiled, watching 3 generations of women who had found each other through crisis and chosen to build something lasting from the experience. Fernando the botfly had brought terror and pain into her life, but he had also brought revelations about community, courage, and the unexpected ways that love grows in the most difficult soil. The scar on her head was barely visible now, but the lessons it had taught would remain with all of them forever. Grace Henderson's story reminds us that our golden years don't have to be golden cages of isolation and fear. At 67, Grace faced every senior's nightmare: a frightening health crisis, mounting medical bills, and a healthcare system that saw dollar signs instead of dignity. Yet through her darkest moments, she discovered something profound. The seeds of kindness we plant throughout our lives often bloom into unexpected salvation when we need them most. Maria Santos, the little girl Grace once tutored, returned as her guardian angel, proving that community connections matter more than bank balances. Grace's courage to fight medical exploitation didn't just save her own future. It protected countless other vulnerable seniors from predatory practices. Her daughter Emma learned that career success means nothing without family bonds, choosing love over ladder climbing. Most beautifully, Grace found that being needed, mentoring Maria, advocating for patient rights, strengthening her neighborhood, gave her life renewed purpose and joy. At any age, we can choose connection over isolation, courage over surrender, and hope over despair. Grace's botfly became her butterfly, transforming her from victim to victor, from lonely widow to beloved community pillar. What unexpected blessing has emerged from your most difficult challenge? Have you reconnected with someone from your past who changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire another reader facing their own struggles.